Welcome to the debate. For millennia, the serpent in the Garden of Eden has been universally recognized as, well, the ultimate villain.
Right, the literal embodiment of Satan.
Exactly. The father of lies, the architect of human downfall. But what if we've been reading the most famous story in human history completely backward?
That is a staggering premise, honestly.
It is, because what if the Hebrew text actually points to the serpent not as the origin of evil, but as the very first symbol of Christ?
I mean, usually when we look at foundational legal documents or, ancient charters, there's an assumption that we just have to read the text exactly as it's written.
Right.
You look at the definitions, the syntax, the specific clauses, and you derive the meaning strictly from the constraints of the page. You do not bring outside rumors into a contract.
You don't. But when you step into the world of biblical interpretation, specifically the early chapters of Genesis, that strict textual discipline often just vanishes.
Yeah, it really does.
We're looking at a narrative landscape that has been completely paved over by centuries of inherited tradition. So today, we are examining the profound theological and structural significance of the Nahash.
Which is the Hebrew word for the serpent in Genesis 3.
Right. So is the Nahash the adversarial, satanic origin of evil, or is it a Christological archetype, a figure of wisdom appointed by God to bear the burden of human mortality?
Which is quite the leap for a lot of people.
It is, but this debate emerges directly from the source material provided by Zachary David Enfield, which frankly challenges our most ingrained interpretive traditions using strict Hebrew grammar and narrative sequence.
Yeah, and we are going to get into that grammar.
We are. I will be arguing the text's precise position that the Nahash is a redemptive archetype seamlessly fulfilled at the cross. I am standing my ground on the actual text today.
Well, and I will defend the traditional canonical view. I'll argue that the Nahash is the adversarial satanic origin of the fall of humanity, and that this understanding is a structural necessity for the entire biblical narrative to function.
Let me outline the perspective of the text itself then. Because if we strip away the centuries of, medieval artwork and Miltonarian poetry, a completely different figure emerges.
Okay, let's hear it.
Genesis never, not once in the entire Hebrew text, labels the Nahash as evil, wicked, or a liar. It is introduced with the Hebrew word arum, which means wise, perceptive, or prudent.
But it still initiates the conversation that leads to the fall.
I will assert firmly that the Nahash did not deceive Eve. Instead, it engaged with a command that she had already altered herself. Furthermore, what tradition calls the curse in Genesis 3:14 was actually a cultic elevation.
A cultic elevation? For a serpent?
Yes, a promotion to a priestly sacrificial role. The text says the Nahash is placed above all livestock, which in Torah terminology means sacrificial animals.
Uh-huh.
The Nahash is assigned the highest vocational burden-bearing human mortality, which the text defines as dust. This isn't some theological innovation. It's the only way to make sense of Jesus later identifying his own crucifixion with the lifted serpent in John 3.
Well, I come at it from a very different way. The traditional perspective is not just some lazy assumption, right? It is the connective tissue of the canon.
If you say so.
It is. The Nahash initiates the fall of humanity by directly contradicting God's warning. God says you will surely die, and the Nahash says you will not surely die.
Which we'll get to.
That is the introduction of deception into the human experience. I argue that the curse language, crawling on the belly, eating dust, points universally in ancient literature to humiliation, defeat, and judgment.
I completely disagree with that reading of the Hebrew.
But you can't ignore it. It doesn't point to some sacred redemptive vocation. And crucially, we cannot isolate Genesis from the rest of the Bible. Revelation explicitly identifies the ancient serpent as the devil and Satan.
I see why the tradition makes that move.
It makes it because it's unified. To claim the serpent as a Christ figure fractures the unity of the scriptural witness. You're turning the ultimate symbol of rebellion into a symbol of salvation.
Like I said, I see why tradition goes there, but I am not going to cede the grammar of the page to a thematic feeling. I just won't do it.
It's not a feeling, it's textual harmony.
I want to stand firmly on what the text actually says versus what we assume it says. Let's look at the anatomy of the conversation in Eden. You claim the Nahash introduces deception by contradicting God's command.
Because it does. The text presents a direct subversion of divine law. God sets a boundary regarding the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right?
Right.
And the Nahash intentionally leads humanity into transgression by promising them divine status and immunity from death. It is the primal lie. It's the fracture point between creator and creation.
I have to call out this reliance on inherited assumptions because the Hebrew verbs tell a completely different story here. Who actually introduced the deception?
The serpent did.
No. The text proves Eve added to God's command before the Nahash ever challenged the premise. In Genesis 3:3, Eve says to the Nahash regarding the fruit, "God has said, you shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die."
Right.
But God never said, touch it.
Well, she exaggerates the command, certainly.
It's more than an exaggeration. It's a fundamental alteration of the divine word. If you look at Genesis 2:17, God only said, you shall not eat of it. Eve deceived herself by modifying the boundary.
Okay, but
Let me finish this point. The Nahash merely engaged her already modified version, and we completely ignore Adam's role in this. Genesis 3:6 says Eve gave the fruit to her husband with her. The Hebrew word is imah. He was standing right there the entire time.
he was present, yes.
He heard the whole exchange, and he chose to eat. 1 Timothy 2:14 explicitly states that Eve was deceived, but it never says the Nahash deceived her.
That's a fascinating grammatical distinction. But have you considered the actual outcome of the scene?
The outcome is mortality.
Yes, but even if Eve altered the command in her own mind, the result of the conversation with the Nahash is still human disobedience. The Nahash facilitates the fall. A figure of pure wisdom wouldn't steer humanity into exile.
Facilitation of a conversation is not the origin of deception, though. If a lawyer asks a witness a clarifying question and the witness perjures themselves, the lawyer isn't the origin of the lie.
But the serpent outright says they won't die.
When the Nahash says you will not die, we assume it's a lie because we assume the Nahash is Satan. But what if it's speaking substitutionary truth?
Substitutionary truth? How do you mean?
God said, in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. They ate it. Did they die that day?
Not physically, no. Adam lived to be 930 years old. The tradition understands that as a spiritual death taking effect immediately.
Right, the tradition has to invent the concept of spiritual death to explain why God's timeline didn't happen literally.
I wouldn't say invent.
It's an insertion. But what if they didn't die that day because the Nahash, as a vocational figure, was appointed to bear the consequence of that death in their place?
Okay, but if we accept your premise for a moment that the Nahash isn't deceiving Eve, we still run into a massive structural problem in the text itself.
What's the problem?
The text literally calls the serpent cursed. In Genesis 3:14, God dooms it to crawl on its belly and eat dust.
Let's talk about the curse then.
Across ancient Near Eastern literature and biblical poetry, being brought down to the dust and crawling on the belly is the universal language of defeat, demotion, and total humiliation. It is a judgment upon an adversary. How do you explain a wise, redemptive figure being doomed to eat dirt?
I am so glad you brought that up, because this is where we have to translate the Hebrew correctly, and I will not give ground on this point. Let's look at the word used in Genesis 3:14, mikal.
Okay.
You're reading the word as a demotion, as if the Nahash is being cast down beneath the animals. But mikal means more than, or set apart from, or set above. The text literally says, cursed are you above all livestock.
Wait, you are translating cursed as an elevation? How does that work? A curse is a curse.
When you say cultic elevation, for those who might not be deep into Old Testament temple theology, you have to look at what the livestock represents.
The animals in the field.
In the Torah, livestock, the cattle, the sheep, the goats, they aren't just random barnyard animals. They are the sacrificial system. They are the animals whose blood covers human sin.
I follow you there.
So if the Nahash is set above the sacrificial animals, it is being elevated to the ultimate sacrificial role.
But the text still uses the word cursed, arur.
Even if it is set apart from the livestock, it is still bearing a curse. It's told to eat dust. That is a punishment.
It is a burden, absolutely. But eating dust is not zoology. It's theology. We have to let Genesis define its own terms. So, how does Genesis define dust?
Well, God forms man from the dust of the ground in Genesis 2.
Exactly. And what does God say to Adam just 5 verses after speaking to the Nahash? Genesis 3:19. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return.
So dust equals human mortality.
Yes, this is the core of it. Dust is human mortality. Therefore, to be assigned by God to eat dust is not a dietary restriction for a literal reptile. It is a theological assignment to consume, carry, and bear human mortality.
Wow, that changes the framing entirely. You're saying that eating dust means consuming the death of humanity?
Think of it like a lightning rod on a house.
Okay.
The Nahash isn't causing the lightning strike of human mortality, right? It's the conductor placed high up on the structure to absorb the strike so the house doesn't burn down. That is what eating the dust means.
I see.
It is the ultimate substitutionary burden. The Nahash is absorbing the mortality that was meant for Adam and Eve. That's why they didn't drop dead that day.
I understand the mechanics of the metaphor, and it is undeniably beautiful. But I have to push back hard here, because your reading creates an absolute canonical problem.
I don't think it does, but go ahead.
We are talking about typological fulfillment versus apocalyptic identification. You cannot read Genesis in a vacuum. The Bible interprets the Bible.
I entirely agree. Let's look at how the Bible interprets it.
Then look at Revelation 12.9. It is unequivocal. It throws down a massive anchor for how early Christians understood this text.
Right, the ancient serpent.
Exactly. It says that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. It explicitly identifies the serpent of Genesis as the adversary.
But you're skipping over the rest of the Torah to get to Revelation.
I'm not skipping. I'm looking at the culmination. Furthermore, going back to Genesis 3:15, right after the dust comment, God introduces enmity. The Hebrew word is iva. God says, I will put enmity between you and the woman.
Yes, the enmity.
That is the introduction of the satanic condition. It is the origin of opposition. You cannot extract the Nahash from the adversarial role when the text itself introduces the very concept of enmity right there. The Church's interpretive tradition has recognized for millennia that this ancient serpent represents the reality of the devil.
This is exactly where the traditional move breaks down, and I have to call out the theological impossibility it creates.
It doesn't create an impossibility.
It does. You are using Revelation, written thousands of years later, to overwrite the foundational grammar of the Torah. If the Nahash is Satan as you claim, then what do you do with Numbers 21?
You're referring to the bronze serpent in the wilderness.
Yes, the Israelites are dying from venomous snake bites. God commands Moses to forge a bronze Nahash and lift it up on a pole, and anyone who looks at the bronze serpent is healed and saved from death.
Right.
So if the Nahash is Satan, why is God using a satanic symbol for salvation? God doesn't heal his people through the avatar of their destroyer.
Well, one could argue God is subverting the symbol of the enemy. He's taking the instrument of their destruction, putting it on display, and conquering it, like a victory trophy.
But that falls apart entirely when you get to John 3:14. Jesus explicitly identifies himself with that lifted serpent.
He's making a typological comparison.
Jesus says, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Jesus does not identify himself with a conquered enemy. He does not say, as the avatar of Satan was lifted up, so must the Son of Man be.
Well,
He is claiming the identity of the Nahash. You cannot have God commanding the creation of a satanic symbol and then having Jesus Christ identify himself with a satanic symbol. It completely breaks the theology of the cross.
but what do you do with John's vision in Revelation? You can't just ignore that John specifically points back to the garden and calls the ancient serpent Satan.
I'm not ignoring it at all. I'm reading it as apocalyptic shorthand, which operates under different rules than historical narrative.
Shorthand.
Yes. In Revelation, the author calls the city of Rome Babylon. That doesn't mean Rome is geographically located in Mesopotamia, And it doesn't mean Rome is literally the empire of Nebuchadnezzar.
Sure, it's a symbolic association.
It means Rome is currently embodying the oppressive spirit of Babylon. We must distinguish between the Hebrew concepts of the Nahash and the Tannin.
The Tannin being the dragon or the sea monster.
Exactly. The dragon in Revelation belongs to the Tannin tradition. Throughout the prophets, the Tannin is the symbol of coercive, chaotic empire, like Pharaoh in Ezekiel.
Okay, but
Genesis uses Nahash, which in ancient Near Eastern culture and in this specific text is the symbol of wisdom and healing. They are not the same word and they are not the same concept. Later tradition conflated them, mashing the wisdom serpent and the chaos dragon into one generic villain.
Even if you separate the vocabulary of the dragon and the serpent, you still have not answered for Genesis 3:15.
Bring it on.
God explicitly puts enmity, Iva, between the serpent and the woman. Enmity means hostility. It means war. That is the origin of the adversary. How is a Christ figure in a state of divinely ordained warfare with humanity?
Let's look precisely at what you just said, because this is the grammatical checkmate of the entire traditional position.
A checkmate?
Yes. I will not let the argument stand that Iva makes the serpent Satan. We have to look at how language works. Iva, or enmity, is a predicate. It's a relational condition that exists between two things.
Right.
Satan, in the Hebrew Bible, is a role. It literally translates to the adversary. It is a job description, not an ontological being with a pitchfork.
I agree that Satan translates to the adversary, but the serpent is hosting that adversarial rupture.
But grammatical structure matters. If you claim that the serpent is the adversary, that the serpent is Satan, then you are arguing that when God says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, God is actually saying, I will put the adversary between the adversary and the woman. It breaks the sentence structure. It's a grammatical absurdity. How can God put Satan between Satan and humanity?
Well, this is describing a spiritual reality through narrative. It's not a math equation.
It's grammar.
The enmity is the rupture in the relationship, yes, but the serpent is the initiator of that rupture. You are treating the text like a strict legal code, but it is mythopoetic history.
I am treating the text with the respect it demands. It says God places the adversarial condition, the enmity, the consequence of mortality, between them.
Okay.
Think back to the lightning rod. The Nahash is the Christological line of wisdom, and humanity is the woman's seed. The tension, the consequence, the mortality, that is what stands between them. The Nahash is assigned to bear it.
But tradition,
By insisting that the serpent is the devil, tradition has simply replaced the text's brilliant redemptive architecture with a cartoonish villain.
I understand the precision you are driving at. And honestly, the way you connect the dust to the lightning rod of human mortality is compelling.
Thank you.
But to summarize my position, the traditional framework, which views the Nahash as the root of the adversarial condition, is absolutely necessary for maintaining canonical harmony.
If you say so.
Without it, you unravel the continuity between the fall in Genesis and the ultimate defeat of the deceiver in Revelation. If the serpent isn't the deceiver, then the entire arc of the Bible, from the garden lost to the garden restored, loses its central antagonist.
I just don't think it needs that generic antagonist.
The church's interpretive tradition has recognized for millennia that the ancient serpent represents the reality of the devil. It's the force that seeks to separate humanity from God's life. Reading the Bible is not just about isolated Hebrew definitions. It's about the grand narrative of good and evil.
And to summarize my position, honoring the strict grammatical constraints of the Hebrew and following the actual narrative sequence reveals something infinitely more profound than a simple story of good and evil.
I suppose we fundamentally disagree on the mechanics there.
We do. The Nahash is not the villain. It is the alternate archetype of wisdom. It is the figure elevated above the sacrificial system, assigned to consume the dust of our mortality, lifted up for healing in the wilderness, and seamlessly fulfilled at the cross by Christ himself.
It's a very different paradigm.
When we honor the text over the tradition, the supposed villain disappears and the actual mechanics of the atonement are visible from the very beginning.
There is certainly a profound, ongoing tension here. We are caught between reading a foundational text exactly and strictly as it was written in its original ancient context versus, reading it backward through the lens of centuries of interpretive tradition and apocalyptic theology.
But that tension is what makes this so vital, right? It illuminates just how deep the material goes.
Oh, absolutely.
Reconsidering the symbols of the garden isn't just an academic exercise in Hebrew vocabulary. It forces us to reconsider how redemption actually works. It suggests there's a structural depth to this source material that we have barely begun to explore.
Hidden right beneath the surface of the words we thought we knew so well.
Precisely.
Well, we certainly haven't settled the millennial-old debate today. We will leave it to the listener to weigh the strict grammatical constraints of the Hebrew against the weight of canonical apocalyptic interpretations.
Indeed. We started today by picturing a judge looking at the strict definitions of a legal charter, pushing past the whispers of a millennia-long game of telephone.
A very long game of telephone.
The question that remains is this. When we finally hold the original contract up to light and look at the exact words on the page, are we brave enough to accept that the story it tells might be entirely different and infinitely more beautiful than the one we were told to expect?